Hello, everyone. It's about 12, looks like it's 12:02 now, so we'll get started so we can get the ball rolling on today's event. I just want to say thank you to the current students, alumni, and Carleton community for joining us online today as we celebrate Carleton U's first virtual homecoming celebration. Homecoming is a celebration of all that was, is, and is yet to be from the brilliant minds that make up Carleton University's community. So my name is Juliet Alfie, and I'll be the MC for this afternoon's event for the Faculty of Engineering and Design called Lessons in Rapid Transit, Climate Change in the Post-Pandemic World. I went to Carleton. I graduated from the FED's Architectural Conservation and Sustainability program back in 2017, and now I work as a structural engineering intern, or EIT, at COT, which is a building supply company in Ottawa. So in this talk, we have a few panelists. So we have Dr. Amir Hakami, Dr. Ahmed Abdulla, and Dr. Kristen Schell. And they will discuss how some of the lessons we have learned from the national and global response to COVID-19 can help us address the Herculean climate crisis as we seek to stabilize the climate over the next several decades. So just to get started, I want to let all the alumni joining us today know that there are many ways that you can get involved with our Alumni Association, the CUAA-EC. This includes all the ways listed on the next PowerPoint slide that you can see now. That'll pop up. There we go. So there's a list of ways you can get involved. Next, I'm going to just run through a few housekeeping items. So because this is a Zoom webinar and therefore all attendee microphones and videos have been automatically disabled. So there's an option to anonymously ask the panel questions. So you'll be able to type in the Q&A box that shows up on your screen. So feel free to do so. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, but just be mindful that with a high volume of questions, we can't guarantee that every single one will be answered today. And the webinar is being recorded for those who are not able to attend. So just be mindful of that. And we've enabled closed captions for this webinar. To access them, just click on the closed captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and hopefully that's up and running for you today. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce the Dean, Dean Larry Kostyuk. For those who have not yet met the Dean, he joined the faculty last summer and came to FED from the University of Alberta, where he spent over 25 years. He's a well-respected educator and widely published in the field of mechanical engineering, and has received many distinguished honors, including an appointment as a fellow of the Canadian Society for Mechanical Engineering, and as well as the Canadian Academy of Engineering. Please join me in welcoming the Dean as he'll take the stage first here for us today.
Okay, thank you, Julia, and thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. As Julia said, I'm Larry Kostyuk. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and Design here at Carleton. And it is a pleasure to thank you for joining us online today as we host a special panel talk with a few of our professors who work in this relevant area as part of Carleton's week-long roster of digital events and marking the university's 2020 throwback throwback homecoming celebration. So over the past few years, many of you have joined us during homecoming for our usual celebration of Carleton engineering, architecture, industrial design, and information technology alumni that we host out in Canada. Now, given our collective shift to the online world, we thought we'd take the opportunity to change things up a bit this year and share some of the amazing research that is coming out of Carleton. Well, today's talk events understandably cannot replicate the sort of the close-knit interactions between alumni and our faculty that we would normally enjoy in our in-person celebrations. It's important for each of us to maintain a sense of community amongst our friends and colleagues, even though we're unable to gather together at this time. With that in mind, I'd like to note that we're always eager to learn and hear more about your experiences at Carleton. I love to collect stories of people's times here as I try to get to understand Carleton more and find ways in which we might support you. We're always thrilled to hear from alumni and invite you to share those stories with all of us, or let us know how you might be interested in collaborating with our faculty and its experts. Rest assured, when circumstances allow, unfortunately that still seems to be a little ways away, I would like nothing more than to celebrate with each one of you in person again. Until then, I hope you enjoy the great talk we have lined up for you today and wish you all the best. Thank you once again, and without further delay, I'll pass the screen back to Julia and enjoy the talks. Bye.
Thank you for the warm remarks. And now we'll move right along, and I'm delighted to introduce to you the panel for this afternoon's discussion. The panel is going to be introducing a few overarching themes before we move into a panel moderated Q&A session, and then we'll open the floor up for an audience Q&A as well. So, Dr. Amir Hakami is the faculty's Dean of Research and Graduate Studies. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His research addresses policy questions at the interface of air pollution, public health, climate change, economics, and environmental justice. Dr. Hakami was recently announced as one of the 5 Carleton University researchers that received a combined $1.25 million in support from the exploration stream of the New Frontiers in Research Fund to support high-risk, high-reward research. Then we'll have Dr. Ahmed Abdulla, who recently joined the faculty as part of the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, coming to us from Carnegie Mellon University, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Dr. Abdulla co-leads the Alternative Pathways for the Energy Transition Research Group at Carleton. APEX comprises a group of highly interdisciplinary engineers devoted to accelerating the transition to a deeply decarbonized energy system in Canada and across the world in order to avert the worst consequences that could come of climate change. Then finally, the third panelist is Dr. Kristen Schell, who has also recently joined the faculty as part of the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, coming to us from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, where Dr. Schell was part of a team awarded a U.S. Department of Energy Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy Grant. As co-lead of APEX, Dr. Schell's research advances methods in mechanical design, machine learning, and optimization to better integrate variable renewable energy into the power system. So, Dr. Ahmed Abdulla, I welcome you to kick us off on the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you all for attending this event. It's a privilege to be here. We've each chosen to anchor our 5-minute opening statements on a different theme where the response to COVID might inform our potential response to climate change. And I use the term potential response to climate change rather advisedly. Despite the investments we've made over the past 2 decades, the fossil share of energy consumption across the world has only fallen from about 88% in 1990 to 86% in 2015. So it's falling at about 1% per decade, which is simply not enough. And in fact, jurisdictions worldwide are now discussing emergency responses to climate change. Governments representing nearly 300 million people, scores of scientists across the world have made formal declarations of a climate crisis and have demanded a crisis response. And the 2 figures you see before you show why we need a crisis response. So on the left, you have CO2 emissions trajectories through the end of the century, developed using models of the global climate and energy system. And they're clustered based on the targets that they are designed to achieve. So the bottom 2 clusters you see in yellow and in blue represent trajectories that are consistent with the Paris Agreement's goals of keeping warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. And what you see is that a growing number of these trajectories have to dip into what's called net negative emissions territory. In other words, we waited so much time that some scenarios now require active remediation or active removal of the CO2 that we've already emitted into the atmosphere. And the figure on the right reveals the consequences of this inaction. So if we had started mitigating CO2 emissions at the turn of the century, around the time the Kyoto Protocol was signed, then we would have faced a very steep and very expensive pathway to zero, but it's nothing compared to the pathway that we're on now. And eventually, the scale of the challenge overwhelms our physical capacity to scale up the technologies required to achieve that legally enshrined target of Paris's well below 2 degrees Celsius. So it's important to explore how normal decision-making, what we've been used to, differs from crisis decision-making as far as climate change is concerned, because the crisis framing is really permeating the social and political discourse in more countries, and that's being catalyzed by COVID. So one thing a crisis does, perhaps, is give you clarity and forces you to reevaluate your options. There's growing research, and we contribute to quite a bit of it here at Carleton, on how people's attitudes to technology shift and how opposition to something might shift to reluctant acceptance when the scale of the challenge kind of becomes apparent to people. And three of the most prominent examples of this, in my judgment, are what you see before you: the continued penetration of renewable energy sources, the use of nuclear power for decarbonization, and the continued use of fossil infrastructure, and whether that will continue to be permitted. So first, renewables, despite their land use impacts and their variability and intermittency, the public generally supports renewables across the world and wants to see more of them. I'm generalizing, of course, but also integrating globally, though perhaps not in their backyard. But support for renewables has been robust, and we'll keep encroaching on nature in that way, in other words. And locally, there may be some bad consequences of deploying renewables in certain locations. The second technology is nuclear power. Opposition to nuclear power is solid across the EU. It's solid across Japan and other major countries. It is not as solid in North America. The public is split halfway on the question. And interestingly, in the UK, the government's decade-long effort to publicize nuclear power as low carbon has led to the emergence of what's called a segment of reluctant acceptors, people who are willing to deploy nuclear power if you tell them climate change is a bigger threat. And on the right, you see the biggest open question in my judgment, which is what to do with legacy or existing fossil infrastructure. We could leverage an enormous amount of today's energy sector, the pipelines, the plants, for the fight against climate change. We could deploy renewable natural gas. We could do power to gas, i.e. making clean hydrogen. We could use the CO2 pipelines that we have to sequester carbon. Whether the public will allow this is a completely different question, of course, and it's one that engineers and social scientists working together need to answer if we want to provide the energy sector with a soft landing in the unfolding and highly disruptive energy transition. And so with that, I will now pass the ball to Professor Hakami for his opening statement.
Thank you, Ahmed. So I thought that I try to take a stab at comparing these two global threats that we are facing in climate change, as well as the pandemic in economic terms. And obviously, there's quite a bit more established literature on the climate change side, and while the situation on the pandemic side is very fluid and evolving. In short, some of the challenges that Ahmed referred to come down to the amount of money that we have to spend and the investment that we have to make. And there are many different studies. I think I've picked one set of numbers that speculate that to achieve the 2-degree warming targets of the Paris Agreement, we need to spend about $22 trillion globally until 2050 to maintain that target, and obviously almost double that, $40 trillion to reach 1.5 degree warming. And that is beyond what the countries, the signatories of the agreement have already agreed to. Those levels, existing commitments, the investments are estimated to be about $7.5 trillion, and obviously they do not get us to the 2-degree warming. Just to put that in perspective, when we talk about trillions of dollars, the GDP of Canada is about $1.5 trillion. The total global economy is about $80 trillion. So in very simple terms, if you want to think about the scale of this investment, this needed investment, it's like thinking that you're living on an annual income of $80,000, and you know that your house requires major repair, otherwise it could crumble on you, and that is going to cost you somewhere between $20,000 to $40,000, depending on how comprehensive you want that repair to be, and that's the money that you have to borrow and amortize it over the next 25 or 30 years. It's a lot of money, but it is not impossible. To build on the house analogy, then you can also think that if your contractor comes in and tells you that, if you don't take action now, things are going to get worse, and it's going to cost money by the day or by the year in this case. And that's what this plot on the left side is showing you. That's essentially the annual investment needed to attain the levels of warming of 1.5 degree in green or 2 degrees in blue, depending on the year that we would have started those investments. So if we had started back in 1980s, it would have been a lot more feasible than it is now to maintain 1.5 degrees. And I mean, right now we probably are about to miss that opportunity altogether, or it has become very difficult economically speaking. And that scale of expenditure and investment is what I think is quite comparable to the situation that we are seeing with the pandemic. So right now, I think by mid-June, I think Kristen is going to talk about this as well, but that close to $9 trillion has been committed or spent on the relief funding from different governments, either in the form of relief or commitments and guarantees. And there are some estimates that this could be as much as $20 trillion by the end of the year. And a contraction in global GDP of about 5% is what the World Bank is projecting. If you think about the human cost or the human loss of the pandemic, we have just surpassed 1 million deaths. But again, in terms of putting that into perspective, on the climate change side, every year there are about more than 4 million people dying from air pollution. And I picked that aspect of pollution because that's what I work on. And much of those deaths come as a result of burning fossil fuels. So it's not directly related to the climate change, but it is the same driver as the climate change. If we were at a net zero or free from fossil fuel, most of those deaths would not happen. So in terms of scale of the human costs, I think it is fairly safe to say climate change is going to be more significant than the pandemic that we are experiencing, not trivializing the burden that the pandemic has put on all countries, but just a question of a scale. And yet we spent pretty much the same amount of money, or we are going to spend the same amount of money in 1 year that we have resisted to invest on climate change. And that really reflects the fact that how we discount the future, the threats that come into the future rather than immediate threats. If I can go to the next slide, please. And that discounting, or the rate of discounting, is one of the main complications in quantifying the impact of climate change. But another one is the fact that the distributional effect of climate change is very variable across different nations. The plot on the left is what is referred to as the Lorenz curve. And that is the social costs of carbon on a country level basis, aggregated all the way as sorted from the countries that incurred the least cost to the countries that have the highest cost. And as you see, there are actually countries in that particular scenario that is depicted that would benefit from a climate change, but overall, this estimation of social costs under this particular scenario adds up to about $400 per ton of CO2. But that impact is very, very much variable across different countries. And I think that's one of the major complications that we're facing. And with that also comes how different countries are going to respond in terms of the stimulus packages that they're introducing. And many of them have not come out yet, but from the ones that have come out, really the European Union has been the only one that has paid significant attention to the green economy and to tackling climate change while they're investing in the recovery, in the economic recovery. I'll stop with that and I pass to Kristen for her comments.
Thank you, Amir. If I could have the next slide, please. So the graph, I think Amir hit on one of the main linkages between the pandemic and the climate crisis, which I would like to emphasize. So the graph on the left is from the International Monetary Fund, and it shows that just from March to May, which was only 3 months, globally governments mobilized $9 trillion, which is equivalent to about 1/10 of the global annual GDP. And I think this is one of the biggest things that we've learned from the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, that the world has proven to itself that it can mobilize large amounts of money in order to manage a global crisis. And I think that bodes well for how we can mobilize ourselves to face the climate crisis. The graph on the right shows the cost that we see for the energy transition and how we move from our current energy system from fossil fuels to a lower carbon energy system. It's estimated that we need between $1.6 to $3.5 trillion per year globally. And when you think about this number, as Amir was pointing out, it's actually very feasible. The current global investment in energy is about $1.7 trillion. So we're already investing in the energy sector, the amount of money that we need. We just need to figure out how to make that shift from fossil fuels towards a more low carbon system. So cost isn't really the issue. In 2018 alone, in the Canadian energy system industry, spent $75 billion on capital investments. Combined with another $300 billion in investments, the money moving around just the Canadian energy industry is about 1/4 of the total global costs that we need for this energy transition. And so the question really is, what's keeping us from making this change? And it's really the transition away from our infrastructure related to fossil fuels. So some of the audience may be wondering why this heavy emphasis on energy over climate change. And I think that's one issue that's not underscored enough in the media, is that our use of energy is the reason why we have to deal with climate change to begin with. You can trace back our greenhouse gas emissions, around 70% of them, towards our combustion of fossil fuels, whether it's for moving around for transportation and gasoline, moving large industry equipment for agriculture, and creating heat in order to make a lot of the materials we use in everyday life, cement and steel for buildings. So humans' ability to transform energy is fantastic, and the reason why we've had so much economic growth in the past couple hundred years. In this graph, you can see what's known as the Sankey diagram for Canada, and it shows the energy system as it exists today. On the left-hand side, we see the primary energy supply that we have that feeds into all these different energy conversions and the different ways that we use useful energy for work, such as electricity and transport. The main point of this graph is that our energy system is very heavily reliant on fossil fuels. We see on the left-hand side, you can see over 70% from crude oil, natural gas, coal, and biomass. The crux of the issue is the time it takes to construct a new power plant and how we're moving from fossil fuels towards this new low carbon future. We need to move about 50% of our electricity production from fossil fuels towards renewables. And for example, it takes about 5 to 10 years to start on the construction of a power plant and finish in order to produce electricity. So what we know from the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and on how we can limit our global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius is that we need to make these investments today. We have about 7.5 years in order to transition the system before we start facing the kind of crisis that we've seen with the pandemic. We have to make immediate and increasingly unsustainable financially decisions. But the good news is that this change for our energy system can happen. We can start today and we can move towards a more viable future. What it really takes, if we have the money, then what it really takes is sustained leadership. The role of government in coalition building, target setting, and negotiating new futures with these entrenched fossil fuel interests. With that opening statement, I'll pass it back to Julia for the panel discussion.
Okay, great. So thank you to all three panelists for sharing your thoughts on obviously this very interesting topic today that's very relevant. So to get the discussion flowing, I have a few questions for the panel. While the audience members are welcome to queue up their questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom interface here. So please submit your questions. And then in the meantime, I'll ask a couple. So maybe in more explicit terms, why link COVID and climate change? So I'm hoping the panelists who are coming back on screen here for us can take a few minutes to maybe just make explicit the similarities and contrasts between the two events, especially in light of recent months with all the discussion that links other topics to COVID too and its obvious relevancy.
I can probably speak to the similarities, and then maybe others can talk about contrasts or additional similarities. I can think of quite a few, and it's actually pretty intriguing in what ways these two seemingly disparate phenomena are similar to each other. If you think about climate change, and the reason that we haven't really taken the actions that we should have taken a long time ago, two main reasons come to mind. And one is that it could entail changes to our way of life. It could include behavioral changes that we were not comfortable with. And the second one is that it costs a lot of money. And, the pandemic just shattered those two things. We, in a very short period of time, we completely, as drastically as we could have imagined, have changed our way of life. And also we are spending astonishing amounts of money on economic recovery. So that's the first thing that really, to me, links the two. The second thing is, if you think about it, both the virus and climate should be kind of egalitarian threats. The virus doesn't really think if this person is poor or rich, or the climate doesn't really check to see if this is a poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood. But in reality, the impacts of climate change and the impacts of the pandemic have developed along very strong socioeconomic gradients, both at the national level, but also at the sub-national level. And I think that's a very significant similarity, and also something that I hope we can learn from the pandemic and address that in climate change. And the third point, building on top of that inequality, is if you think about it, we know both of these threats are global threats, and therefore it's very reasonable to assume that the rational, efficient pathway to address them is through international cooperation. But that spirit of international cooperation notwithstanding, there are always these undertones of national interest and patriotism that come into the play with both of these. With the pandemic, we saw that in the PPE warfare and plane hijacking or ambushing that happened in the early days, and now we see it with vaccine nationalism, and with climate change. Those things trickle down to some technical questions, but also philosophical questions of who should be held liable for CO2 emissions, or is it the nation? Are those the nations that are emitting the CO2 now? Is it the current CO2 emissions that matter, or is it the cumulative CO2 burden on the atmosphere that matters? Should the stage of technological development of a nation be taken into account? So all those things, and I think it would be very interesting to see how those interplays between national versus global discourse is going to play out in the future.
I'd like to jump in with two very quick points before we move on to something else. One is that they've both exposed the degree to which there will be entrenched minorities denying the problem, whatever the problem is, no matter how severe it is. Whether we used to say people don't care about climate change because it's in the distant future, and we discount distant things that are in the future. Even with an immediate threat like COVID, there was a degree of denial, and it's actively sabotaged some efforts to contain the virus. So we need to do away with this notion that we will always bring everyone along, because we feel that it's even in the most extreme case. The other is the role of government. We keep saying that climate change is a markets problem and markets will fix it. Seems like markets massage problems more than addressing them head on. And in the COVID case, we saw how some governments were actually quite effective in managing the problem.
I'll just say that the market idea, yeah. I think in COVID, we've seen the role of government in stepping in and taking leadership on an issue, as only the government has the backing to do. And as Ahmed was saying, we've in the past said that we need a carbon market in order to induce investments in low carbon energy, and we haven't had one because no one can agree on it. The climate crisis and the energy transition is in a similar need, in that we need the investment of governments and to put up the money in order to make this long-term transition. We also need the government to help come up with negotiations for people who, not just personally, who might be losers out of some of the transition, but on a larger market stage. Provincially, we need the government to really work with Alberta to figure out how to move its industry, not completely away from fossil fuels. As we can see in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, we don't actually have to transition completely away, but we need the government to help make those negotiations. And really, we've seen in other issues such as the technological revolution and Facebook and the social learning platforms, most industries are waiting for the government to tell them what to do. We've seen tech CEOs ask the government to regulate them so that they can just implement the regulations. They have some certainty on how we see this playing out long term, and they can work within those constraints.
Okay, great. So maybe next the panelists can discuss the specific changes that the pandemic could catalyze in terms of attitudes towards climate change. If you have any thoughts on that.
I'd be happy to go ahead. I do think the pandemic has, well, I just stated one, which is this notion that we know that there will always be a minority that will not go along with any transition. And sometimes it doesn't even conflict with their interests. Sometimes it furthers their interests, but they don't go along with it for various reasons, some psychological, some social, some political. So I think one thing it will catalyze is a growth perhaps in this reluctant acceptance category. People have finally a much greater understanding of the potential benefits of a course of action despite its high immediate costs. And that's a very hard case to make in the absence of an example. And I think COVID gives us some firepower to, it's another example, in other words.
I think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead, Kristen, go.
I was just going to say that I think the example part is a big part of how we'll be able to move forward. What we know from the field of decision sciences is that people tend to discount risks personally unless they have some direct association with it. So for COVID-19, we've seen a lot of uptake in, increase in cases over the summer in the age range of 20 to 30. And it's hypothesized that that's because that age range typically did not have a direct experience with someone who had COVID, unless you saw your grandfather in the hospital and how they were suffering. The risk is really kind of not internalized, and we'll be seeing, for better or worse, more of that internalization as we see the impacts of climate change happen, with the increasing wildfires in the West and people having to move out of their homes. The increase in flooding here in Ottawa, in Gatineau, and the government supporting people relocating. So I think that's one positive.
I also think that, if you think about it, both of those, you talked about that these are, the scale is global, and these are, to some extent, semi-existential threats, or existential. We don't really know how existential a threat climate change is. But climate change will unfold over multiple decades. And we are dealing with, how are we going to, from a policy perspective, how should we basically bring nations together and different stakeholders together and address this? But by the time we go through that, it's probably late. So it's a long process that you can't really learn from and apply back to it, because it unfolds over such extended period of time. The pandemic, on the other hand, is like the same thing, but on fast forward. So it happens over a very short period, and a lot of the same challenges we are facing, a lot of the same challenges that, for example, Kristen and Ahmed were mentioning in terms of consensus building or conflicting interests between different parties, etc., etc. And one hope is that we can learn from whatever experience is going to be, we can learn over the next year or so, hopefully, and apply that to climate change, because it is really a fast forward preview of what we're going to go through, in that the slow motion problem that we have, that is climate change.
Okay, great. Thanks for the additional thoughts there. So it looks like now we can turn it over to the audience. It looks like there's more than a handful of questions actually in the Q&A box. So I'll let the panel have a look at those, and then they can give some answers back to the audience on their questions as they see fit now. So you can submit to the Q&A box, and yeah, we will get to those now.
So if you don't mind, I'll go through them, and so Kristen and Ahmed are the real experts on the energy side, and I see that a lot of questions are on the energy. So if you don't mind, Ahmed and Kristen, I'll address a couple of those. And a couple of those are the investments that you think that different companies might be making in green energy, in low carbon pathways, including fossil fuel industry, which obviously has a conflict of interest there, and it's not in their interest. But have they made those decisions, and what are those, if you know of any?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start there, Kristen, before you jump in. Yes, there's a few questions that talk about what is the fossil fuel industry, the energy industry more broadly doing, or what its role will be in the transition. They're actually doing quite a bit, but Kristen mentioned the lack of regulations and regulatory certainty and regulatory credibility. And I feel that is damaging their efforts and all our efforts to transition. For example, one of among the largest investors in offshore wind energy in Europe and now increasingly in the US are companies like Equinor, in other words, the Norwegian state-owned oil company. Shell is a huge investor. If you go in California and plug your EV into a charger, chances are there's a substantial number of Shell-sponsored EV charging stations. So the companies are doing quite a bit of work, the oil and gas companies especially, to try and find their place in this transition. They're exploring things like power to hydrogen gas. They're blending hydrogen gas into the natural gas pipelines. In fact, that's being done in Alberta. 3% of the natural gas, the pipeline flow in Alberta, in some regions, is hydrogen gas. And we're working to increase the percentage of hydrogen in these pipelines to make it cleaner and lower carbon. It's all a question of credibility. Do the incentives exist? Kristen said markets don't matter. If you give a large check to a company like Sask Power to build a carbon capture plant, they would do it. And in fact, they did with Boundary Dam. So it's the credibility of the incentive and the credibility of the revenue streams. And many of our efforts so far to generate credible incentives and revenue streams through market structures have proven to be ineffective, whereas a large check from government is rather effective.
Yeah, I would say that not that markets don't matter. It's that the price of the market doesn't give it's not a strong investment signal. It's an accounting signal of what kind of profit you might be able to make this year, or a daily signal of what your costs are going to be. But it's not a long-term signal on where you should be making these long-term investments. We have seen a lot of fossil fuel companies, especially, well, I would say in the last 5 years, move away from oil. Shell and BP have moved out of drilling for oil in the Arctic. It's just not economically feasible, especially with what they see as the lower trend of the cost of oil. The problem is that nobody is going to make strategic moves in what we need to shift the entire energy system until they get that regulatory signal from government, until they know that this is what the long-term vision is, so we have to pivot that way. So we have seen a lot of companies do small projects and try and move, but they haven't really made the shift. And one example that's really interesting is the natural gas distributor in British Columbia. They're really forward thinking, and they're planning on how to make their natural gas system more towards a hydrogen economy. But again, it's still just a plan, and the investments aren't going to be made unless they get that signal that that's where the world is going.
If you don't mind, I think there was also a question specifically about the role that carbon capture technologies can play, and particularly if going further into the future, not coupled with aggressive action, if we have to rely on them more and more. Which are those feasible? Are there specific technologies that are feasible that you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a suite of technologies called direct air capture technologies. One of them is pioneered in Western Canada by a company called Carbon Engineering. These use liquid or solid sorbent to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then you'd have to sequester it or turn it into fuels. These are very intriguing efforts. They have a huge energy penalty. And in fact, we're now conducting analyses of them. By we, I mean at Carleton. And we're showing that you would need to run the machines that would suck the carbon dioxide out of the air, you would need to expand the energy system maybe twofold to eightfold in some scenarios, depending on the configurations that you're using. And so, and they don't succeed in bending the emissions, the global warming curve down. They only buy you more time. They only bend the curve down and get us back to normal or a stable climate when they are coupled with aggressive mitigation. So there is no substitute to aggressive mitigation, and direct air capture of carbon dioxide is at best a really good arrow in our quiver.
Okay. I think the general question, I think I'm trying to combine a few of the questions here, but given the pandemic and the expected economic recovery, what pathways do you think are the best approaches in addressing the climate change, and what should, for example, a government or the international community do as a whole to address climate change in a post-pandemic world?
Well, I would say that's a difficult question to answer because we've had several attempts at international collaboration through the Conference of Parties, and our current nationally determined commitments to the Paris Agreement will not achieve the below 2 degrees Celsius warming. So we have a chance, I think, and a real opening for individual leadership to show the world that this can be done and how an example of how it can be done. I think Canada is in a really good place to be that leader because of its natural resource mix, and it has the opportunity to help figure out how to make the transition best for all parties, not just an authoritarian ruling on what must be done. And I think a lot of governments are looking for that leader to just stand up and do it.
I would be a bit perhaps more bold than Kristen, and more controversial, and say we don't know the answer, but the studies that are coming out generally rhyme with respect to a couple of major themes. In other words, we will need more electricity, and it has to be derived from low carbon sources. There are easy to decarbonize sectors and hard to decarbonize sectors. So we better do more research and development on the hard to decarbonize sectors, which are some industry that requires high heat, aviation, ocean shipping, but cars are easy. So if you tell me what should countries do, I completely agree with Kristen that this is a problem that's begging for leadership, and we've all collectively failed as countries in providing that leadership. And I know the energy policy debate in Canada can be charged, and it falls to the provinces, but the federal government, I think, should play a more aggressive role. At the risk of being sent back across the border now, I will say that the federal government should play a stronger role in R&D, supporting Canadian industries like direct air capture, for example, or power to hydrogen gas, and in helping provinces develop energy economic plans. So making sure that there are as few losers as possible, and the political economy of the transition is acceptable to all, because the flows of the benefits and costs need to be acceptable for people to sign on to this. It's more of a politics question than an engineering question, I think, at some stage. You need to deploy more infrastructure on the ground, and the government can really help accelerate that effort.
If I may take a stab at that as well, just recently a panel of a few world-renowned economists tried to put their minds together and provide guidance for governments. And for governments in terms of their economic recovery plans, and how they would address climate change. And I think the main point is something that everyone understands here. I'm just going to reiterate it, that it's not every day or every year that we're going to spend $20 trillion on something. So once we do, it's better that we don't just follow a very narrow, specific target. If there are many problems in this world that need addressing, and we feel we're making that type of investment, why don't we try to nudge our strategies to address multiple problems at the same time with the same type of investment? Because a lot of those problems, like poverty, energy, health, they are correlated with each other, and there are solutions that would improve all of this. In any case, the suggestions that came up, or the very broad suggestions that they came up with, are very sensible ones. And I think that goes back to what Ahmed just said, that it's probably not really as much an engineering problem as it is a policy issue. And those were creation, as part of the post-pandemic recovery plans, would be creation of clean physical infrastructure, or investment in clean physical infrastructure. And electrification would be one of those types. And one of the most important ones that they recommend is building efficiency retrofits, which is something that a number of researchers at Carleton work a lot on, as well as clean R&D on sequestration, and finally natural capital investment and ecosystem resilience projects, things like terrestrial sequestration and forestation, etc.
Okay, so I think because it's about looking about 5 to 1 now, that's all the time we have for Q&A today. But I just want to say thanks to all the great questions that we got, and I think we were able to hit on a lot of them, so that's great. And then to wrap up here, on behalf of the Faculty of Engineering Design, I just want to thank everyone in the audience for taking the time to attend the panel discussion. And then also say a special thank you to all the work that went into preparing for today and for sharing your thoughts on the topics. We really appreciate the panelists' time and getting to get their thoughts on these things. I would also like to thank CUES, which is Carleton's event support team, for their help in setting all this up and getting all the technology in line in order to run this event. And there are a few more homecoming events being hosted by Carleton University later this week. So feel free to visit their website, which is at alumni.carleton.ca/throwback for details, as it has all the information listed there for you if you want to get involved with that. And the faculty is also hosting a giveaway contest on their social media channels right now. It's already started. So if you enter, you could win one of 5 $100 Uber Eats gift cards or AirPods Pro. So to participate, just visit one of the faculty's social media platforms, which is shown on the screen right now in the slide deck. And then you could have a chance to be a part of that, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, as you can see, a brief anonymous survey is going to appear on the screen. And if you have the time and an extra minute, we'd really appreciate if you could fill it out. And I just want to say, I hope that everyone takes care and is able to stay connected. And we'll see you at the rest of homecoming this week. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and to the panelists.